So I'm Dr. Rajesh. I'm a consultant critical care at Apollo Health City, Vishakhapatnam. So in continuation of previous topic on tropical diseases, we're continuing today with scrub typhus and severe leptospirosis, the diagnostic dilemma and management. The disclaimer is I'm a consultant intensivist. I'll be talking more with critically ill patients who got infected with the scrub typhus and severe leptospirosis. So this will be outline of my talk. I'll be talking my first half about scrub typhus. In that, I divided into regarding history, pathogenesis, lab diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. The same with severe leptospirosis. So I'll start with scrub typhus. Scrub typhus. So it's an age-old disease. It was described in Japanese and Chinese peoples initially. It's also known as Japanese river fever. So there's an folklore associated with this scrub typhus jungle mite, which is called as the Susugamushi. So in Japanese, Susuga means disease or noxious or harm. Mushi means bug. So the disease caused by an noxious or harmful bug. The scrub typhus has been described during a lot of wars and famines. There's been a lot of devastating epidemics have been described. So initially, the word typhus has been described by Hippocrates, who is the father of medicine. According to him, typhus means there's a confused state of intellectuality. It is especially associated with high fever. So there's been a lot of wars associated with this scrub typhus. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow and Lenin during his Russian revolutionary movements, a lot of his army and his contemporaries have been infected with scrub typhus and had a lot of mortality. So, in his famous words, Lenin has said either socialism will defeat this laws or laws will defeat the socialism. So this is all about history of scrub typhus. Let's go into the disease proper. So it's been caused by an rickettsial organism called Orientia susugamushi. It's a gram-negative cocobacillus. It's a vector-borne zoonosis. Predominantly, the disease is among the animals or among the described shorter mammals, but man will be an end-stage host. So it's been So the scrub typhus has been described in more than 50% of world population, especially in this Susugamushi triangle, where it is the harbor for more than 1 billion of world population. So the area ranges from west to India, from Pakistan, Afghanistan to farmost in the east until northern Australia. So almost like 50% of world population is at risk of getting the scrub typhus. It is transmitted by a mite, which is the trombiculid mite, and it's the infected larva, which is known as chiggers of this trombiculid mite, is the main culprit for transmitting the disease. So coming to the Indian scenario, most of the Indian states, they have had all these scrub typhus. It is predominantly the southern India. So if you can see in this graph where most of the southern India or the central Indian states have been are affected with scrub typhus. So the initial scrub typhus in India has been described during World War II and Indo-Pakistan War in 1965, and there's been a recent resurgence in 1990. And most of the Indian states have been affected, and it is the most common cause of undifferentiated fevers admitting to hospitals and admitting to intensive care unit in southern India. So, as I said, the chiggers or the trombiculid mite larva are the main reason for the transmission of the disease. It's a primarily zoonotic disease where the disease spreads among the smaller mammals or ground feeding birds. Man will be an accidental end host. There is no human to human transfer, but it is transferred among the mammals and ground feeding birds. So when these chigger or the mite of trombiculid mite, when it infects on the smaller mammals and all these ground feeding birds, the scrub typhus or the Orientia susugamushi, the rickettsial bacteria, it enters into the larva of the trombiculid mite, and there is a transovarial transmission where the mite transmits the scrub typhus bacteria to the egg, and then the larva from the egg stage is the infective stage, or the infective organism which transmits the disease to the mite. The usual reservoir animals are rodents and the smaller mammals. So in our scenario, it will be mostly rodents. So the larval stage of trombiculid mite, it bites on usually lymph and some tissue fluid, but it won't feed on blood. So when the mite bites humans, and it produces a classical Eschar, which is the characteristic diagnosis for scrub typhus. So the primary reservoir, as I said, the vector itself is the primary reservoir. It is the trombiculid mite. There are like many types of mites have been described in this trombiculid genus. The most common mite is the Leptobromelium mite. And the vector activity is the main reason for transmission or spread or having epidemics of disease. So the vector activity is predominantly related to the temperature and rainfall and land use and other socioeconomic factors. When you have relatively higher humidity ranging more than 60%, low temperatures and low sunlight, and when there is a dense vegetation, which actually promotes the breeding or spread of the or growth of the vectors, and where when the humans come in contact with the vector, the larval form of the trombiculid mite, they get infected with the scrub typhus. So usually the time period in India is around post-monsoon period from August to January. So what exactly happens is when this trombiculid mite, or the chigger, the larval form of trombiculid mite, when it bites humans, the bacteria or the Orantia sushigamushi, the scrub typhus bacteria, multiplies at the inoculation site, and it produces a small papule initially, which leads to an ulcer, and there will be regional lymphadenopathy, and this characteristic ulcer will finally transform into a classical Eschar along with the lymphadenopathy. So this happens at the site of inoculation. Predominantly, the bacteria, after multiplying at the inoculation site, they will go into the monocyte macrophage system of the body, where it attaches to the all monocytes and macrophages, where they will replicate intracellularly. The bacteria replicate intracellularly, and they will escape the phagocytosis by the phagosomes of human cells, and they will come out, and then the bacteria will be released into the blood, and which disseminates into the multiple organs. In the multiple organs, depending on the severity, depending on the immune response from the host, they will produce cytokine storm, and results in multi-organ dysfunction. So who is going to get multi-organ dysfunction? It predominantly from the cytokine storm, and it is predominantly by the host response. So as I said, the classical diagnosis of scrub typhus is presence of an Eschar at the site of inoculation of the bacteria by the trombiculid mite. So usually the Eschar has seen in almost 7 to 97% of the cases in endemic areas. If you find this classical Eschar, then your diagnosis of scrub typhus is almost near sure. So this Eschar is like seen in almost all the areas all over the body. Predominantly, it is seen in the intertriginous areas, where along the nape of the neck or axilla, or in the lower chest or lower back. And at the area of genitals also, there are Eschars seen. But most of the times in dark-skinned individuals like Indian brown skin, classical Eschars will be missed, and will be having further workup to get the diagnosis. So most of the times in our clinical practice, we'll find Eschar in 50% of the cases, and 50% of the cases we may not find it. So the incubation period is going to be 7 to 21 days. So initial 7 days, if you do any initial workup, you may not find lab diagnosis positive for scrub typhus. You may find it positive only after 7 days of incubation period, or 7 days of your symptoms. So as I said, the predominant system affected will be the monocyte macrophage system, and MODS will be the classical picture which we see in patients admitted to the ICU. This MODS picture classically resembles vasculitis picture. And in case of intubated patients with multi-organ dysfunction syndrome with scrub typhus, the mortality rate can be as high as 50%. So you can see on the right side of the picture where the classical ischias over the nape of the neck and over the upper chest and back areas. And there is a classical picture of ARDS secondary to worsening cytokine storm response to the scrub typhus bacteria. So what kind of multi-organ dysfunction syndromes can have? So the scrub typhus can affect the respiratory system where it can cause interstitial pneumonitis and overwhelming pneumonia with ARDS, or it can have toxic myocarditis. Patients sometimes present with significant thrombocytopenia or pancytopenia with the disseminated intravascular coagulation. There might be possibility of aseptic meningitis feature where patients will be presenting with encephalopathy, and there's rare cases of transverse myelitis can happen where patients can present with even with the paraplegia, and other multi-organ dysfunctions in terms of hepatic failure, renal failures can be seen, but relatively less common compared to picture of ARDS or aseptic meningitis picture. The differential diagnosis, all the typhus-like illnesses are the differential diagnosis. So currently during this season of all the tropical diseases, we can have all other possibilities as the reason for a patient presenting with acute febrile illness with encephalopathy with multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. So you need to rule out malaria, leptospirosis, any of the arboviral infections, which the commonest will be the dengue fever and possibly chikungunya fever, and you need to rule out any other possibilities of meningitis and other atypical fevers, including other hemorrhagic viral fevers. So why there will be a diagnostic uncertainty? This is my main topic of interest, because when I said I'm going to present or talk on leptospirosis and scrub typhus, everyone, like my friends said, like, anyhow you're going to give doxy, so what's so special in your talk? So I'm saying this will be the specialty of my talk. So why there will be a diagnostic uncertainty, especially with scrub typhus? Because as I said, it is the most uncommon or most common cause of it's the most common cause of any acute undifferentiated fever, especially during this tropical fever. And presence of scrub typhus without SR in Indian brown skin makes the diagnostic uncertainty even worse. So we'll be sending all the possible or classical workup for tropical illness. So we can look at some clinical clues which can favor the diagnosis. As I said, presence of SR is more or less makes the diagnosis of scrub typhus likely. And there's been significant clinical prediction rules have been described in literature, which actually says or predicts scrub typhus, and we need to treat the scrub typhus based on the symptomatology. And everyone knows about the lab-based diagnosis and the uncertainty about a lab-based diagnosis. So what are the clinical prediction rules? So this is the paper published from CMC Vellore, which is the Center for India for Tropical Diseases. So according to them, they have given almost like 6 classical or 6 features which actually can diagnose scrub typhus with a significant p-value of less than 0.01, which includes the presence of SR, of course, and is there any presence of regional lymphadenopathy or presence of duration of fever for more than 8 days? Or significant CRP level or ALT by AST ratio more than 1, or defervescence of fever or disease within 48 to 72 hours of specific therapy. So when you have these 6 features, which actually favors the diagnosis of scrub typhus. At the same time, they have described some classical symptoms or classical lab findings, which actually can rule out scrub typhus, or which actually can include other tropical fevers as the reason for diagnosis. So they've given somewhere around 8 to 9 other features which actually can have an idea about alternate cause of acute febrile illness with encephalopathy rather than scrub typhus as the reason for the disease. And apart from that, this is the scoring system developed by them, which actually useful for resource poor countries and unable to perform test countries, like where you may not have the facility to do a specific lab diagnosis for scrub typhus. So there are actually five points given in this clinical prediction rule, and each point has given a specific scoring, and if the score below 3, it actually rules out scrub typhus, and if the score is more than or equal to 3, which gives 100% sensitivity for diagnosis of scrub typhus. The points given are elderly, age of more than 65 years, and recent history of outdoor activities, and there is any illness occurring during outbreak period, and presence of an SR or myalgia. So they're given a specific scoring for each point, and if the score is more than 3, which actually makes scrub typhus as the diagnosis with 100% sensitivity. So as it says 100% sensitive, which means it includes a lot of false positivity, and you might be over treating the patients. So these are the two clinical prediction rules given and described from CMC Vellore in India. So coming to the lab diagnosis, the classical lab diagnosis is to look for the antibody response. And to look for the antibody response, we need to see paired sera. Paired sera means you need to check for antibody levels in the acute phase of the disease, and you need to look for antibody levels during the convalescent phase, which is 2 weeks after the symptoms subside. And between these two paired sera, you need to see fourfold rise in the titers of antibodies, which actually is the classical way of diagnosing scrub typhus. But it may not be useful at bedside, but it will be more for an epidemiological workup to rule out if patients or if any particular area is having epidemic of scrub typhus. And apart from this paired sera or raising titers of antibiotics, there's been other different lab diagnostic tests, which is the primary or age-old Weil-Felix test, which we are not doing nowadays. And other tests are commercially available rapid diagnostic tests, which are known as indirect chromatographic techniques, or ELISA for IgM antibody. These are commercially available or most commonly used diagnostic tests for scrub typhus. Apart from that, the classical gold standard test for diagnosing scrub typhus is immunofluorescence assay or immunoperoxidase assay, which we are not doing in India. So Weil-Felix test, this I heard about Weil-Felix test during my undergraduation, where the antigens actually shared between Proteus mirabilis, which is another gram-negative bacteria, along with Rickettsia. So there is an cross-sensitivity or cross-sensitivity of antibodies between the Proteus antigens and Rickettsial antigens. So if you are trying to find this heterophile antibodies, it gives diagnostic. It's an indirect way of diagnosing scrub typhus infection. So in Weil-Felix test, we actually check for 3 different antigens of Proteus, which is OX2, OXK, and OX19. And in case of scrub typhus, OXK antibody titer will be high in a titer of 1:80, suggestive of possibility of scrub typhus infection. As there is an sharing of antigens between Proteus and Rickettsia, if you are having any Proteus infection, you will have increased OXK antibody levels, and it actually cannot diagnose specifically scrub typhus. So that's the disadvantage of Weil-Felix test. And among the non-molecular lab diagnostic tests, what we routinely do, or most of the hospitals in and around these combined states do, is an CAR test or rapid antigen, rapid diagnostic test, which is the chromatographic test for IgM or IgM and IgG antibodies. Which has relatively lesser sensitivity, but it has more specificity. So what it means is, if your rapid or commercially available rapid diagnostic test is positive, that means you are sure about diagnosis of scrub typhus. But if it is negative, it doesn't rule out the possibility of infection. So in those situations, if your clinical suspicion is really high, and if you want to establish a diagnosis of scrub typhus, it's better to go for IgM ELISA and IgG ELISA, which are relatively more sensitive, so that you can actually rule out false negatives based on your rapid commercially available tests. So the first step is going to be the IgM ICT, the chromatographic test. And then if it is negative, better to go for ELISA to have a confirmatory diagnosis. Apart from that, there are other significant tests which are not useful at bedside or in case of inpatient hospital setup, where you can detect scrub typhus DNA in the HR, or you can have an histopathological examination of the HR site, or you can even identify scrub typhus DNA in the blood, or you can culture scrub typhus in various cell lines. There's been various PCR testings done for specific antigens of scrub typhus. The disadvantage or advantage of all these tests is they can be positive only during the first week of rickettsemia or scrub typhus, because all these DNAs or cell cultures or PCR testings are there the particles of this gram-negative bacilli. So they can be only positive during the first week of rickettsemia. Once you are entering into the second week of disease or the second week into the fever, you may not have all these tests positive. So there you need to actually depend on non-molecular lab-based diagnosis based on your IgM ELISA or IgM indirect chromatographic tests. So this is about much about lab diagnosis of scrub typhus, but at bedside clinically, what we are going to do is we are going to do only most of the times the indirect chromatographic test, and sometimes where if the test is negative, you might go for IgM or IgG ELISA. Coming to the treatment options, so I'll make it short. So treatment options will be supporting the organs in case of multi-organ dysfunction syndrome with ventilation, or supporting with vasopressors, with shock, supporting with renal replacement therapy in case of significant AKI or acidosis, and treatment of secondary bacterial infections, especially those patients who are in ICU with multi-organ dysfunction. The specific therapy is going to be doxycycline. So we have commercially available doxycycline IV, which is given as 100 milligrams BD. The duration of treatment varies from 7 days maximum up to 2 weeks, something around 14 days. The problem with doxycycline, as everyone knows, doxycycline cannot be given for pregnancy, lactation, or in pediatric age groups. So in those situations, you have option of azithromycin, which can be given for a minimum duration of 5 days to maximum duration of 7 days. So we have azithromycin, which is available in oral and IV formulation. There's been very less usage of chloramphenicol, which can be used in scrub typhus, but most of the times we will end up with options of doxy versus azithromycin. And the possibility of drug-resistant or doxy-resistant or azithro-resistant scrub typhus is relatively less common, and there's a role for chloramphenicol if you are suspecting non-responsiveness to doxy or azithromycin. So most of the times, scrub typhus is treated as a part of syndromic approach for acute febrile illness with encephalopathy, or a part of acute febrile illness with multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. And most of the times it is underdiagnosed. The problem is when we are doing the rapid antibody testing with the indirect chromatography, it might come as positive, but if we repeat the same test after a week of symptoms, or after a week of last negative testing, you may find the testing as positive. So that part actually we need to look into if we really want to diagnose scrub typhus. And there's been a lot of debate or a lot of enthusiasm to give prophylaxis for scrub typhus, especially for tourists, because as I said, this Siskamushu triangle, where there's been a lot of areas, including Bangkok, Thailand, and Indonesia, which is the tourist hub. So is there any role for giving prophylaxis? Yes, there's been role for giving doxycycline prophylaxis for all the tourists who are visiting these countries of Susigamushi triangle. So doxy should be given 100 milligrams once in a week until the patients are in this Sushigamishi triangle areas, and once they return back to their native places. And is there any role for developing vaccine, or is there any vaccine for scrub typhus, as it is going to infect more than like a billion of almost a billion of world population is at risk. So there's been no trials, or there's been no commercially available vaccine for scrub typhus, because most of the time scrub typhus is relatively treated as a part of syndromic approach, and then the possibility of getting severe disease is relatively less. So so there's been no vaccination trials have been studied for scrub typhus. So this is about scrub typhus. Then I'll move on to leptospirosis. So leptospirosis, again, it is known as the canicola fever, which we actually aware of something called Weil's disease, which is the severe form of leptospirosis. It's been described almost like more than one and a half or almost one and a half centuries. So it's been described in late 1800s. So leptospirosis actually caused by a spirochetal organism. So which is the spirochete. Spirochete is this spiral of which is the spirally motile organism, and it is described initially in 1886. So there's been a lot of pathogenic species in this leptospirosis, leptospiral organisms, but predominantly the disease has been described initially in tropical and subtropical areas, but there's been significant increase in number of cases in all the first world developed countries, especially especially in persons who are going for any water sporting activities. In developing countries like India, it is most commonly seen in post rainfall season, and across the world, there's been more than 1 million cases will happen. There's been specific serovars have been uh, described for causing particular significant leptospiral diseases. So ichthyohemorrhagic is one of the major serovar, which is actually known to cause this Weil's disease, which was first described during World War II. And in India, post Chennai floods in 2015, there's been significant increase in number of patients who are getting admitted with acute febrile illness and renal failure, or diagnosed to have leptospirosis. So based on all these things, and there's been increase in number of leptospirosis cases across the world. CDC in 2015 actually described or identified leptospirosis as an notifiable disease. Again, this is also an primarily zoonotic disease. The most common reservoir hosts are smaller mammals or the domestic rats. They are the reservoir hosts. And humans are, as usual, the accidental end host. There is no human-to-human transfer of leptospirosis. The most of the times the organism or the spirochete actually stays in the renal system, which is in the breast border of the proximal renal tubule, and then the reservoir mammal or the rats, they will excrete this leptospiral organism into the urine, and once the urine is contaminated either with water or soil or with food, and if humans are exposed with this urine or exposure to the urine or exposed to this contaminated water or contaminated food, which is actually contaminated with the infected rat's urine, you're going to get leptospirosis. So it is most commonly seen in developing countries like in India. It is seen when there are poor housing situations and poor sanitation, and when there is a lot of contamination of water, soil, and food. But in developing countries like US and Canada, it is more seen in outdoor recreation activities or in any of the water sporting activities, or people who are involved in a lot of trekking or doing all these kayaking activities. And as I said, it is the infected animal's urine, which is the main reason for spreading the disease. There's been direct contact of urine or direct contact of infected material or indirect contact through food, or there might be a droplet spread of infection also, because the urine which can actually produce some minimal droplets into the environment, and if we can inhale or if those droplets land on our mucous membranes like conjunctiva or over the oral mucous membranes, we might can develop leptospirosis. So most of the leptospiral infections, up to 90% of the cases, actually they are asymptomatic and easily regulated and may not have any significant symptoms. But in 10% of the cases, the patients will land up with severe leptospirosis, which actually can have a multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. Here also, it is the more about the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory response balance. If there is more of an pro-inflammatory response in individuals, it actually leads to cytokine storm and then more of a multi-organ dysfunction rather than the disease itself. So what could be the clinical manifestations? So clinical manifestations of leptospirosis, it is actually described into three specific syndromes, which is anicteric leptospirosis or icteric leptospirosis or severe leptospirosis. The classical symptoms or presentation symptoms, there's three presentation symptoms, which is fever with chills, myalgia, and fatigue, and three specific signs, which are conjunctival suffusion, calf muscle tenderness, and lymph node enlargement. So initial three symptoms and three signs, if you have in a post rainfall season, during an post-rainfall season, which actually favors diagnosis of leptospirosis. Most important sign will be calf muscle tenderness, and this calf muscle tenderness could be as significant as as significant as causing rhabdomyolysis, and we can find even elevated creatinine phosphokinase levels. So that is one of the classical signs of severe leptospirosis. And in terms of multi-organ involvement, it can involve lungs, which can cause actually hemoptysis and lung hemorrhages, and there can be involvement of kidney. Initially, the leptospirosis renal involvement is non-olguric potassium wasting nephropathy, where patients are not in olguric or anuric phase; they are in relatively in urine output is maintained. But as the disease progresses, they will go into anuric phase. And it can significantly involve liver, which can cause jaundice and transaminitis. Sometimes, if the severity is significant enough, it can involve CNS, which can cause, again, aseptic meningitis picture. Incubation period is around 5 to 14 days, like any of the most of the tropical fevers. But the case fatality rate is significantly low when compared with other tropical illness, and when we compare with the scrub typhus, which is 50%, here the case fatality rate can be as high as 15%. So, because leptospirosis is an CDC recommended notifiable disease, so we need to actually notify the authorities regarding diagnosis of leptospirosis. So there's been three case definitions have been given, which is a suspected leptospiral infection, or probable leptospiral infection, or confirmed leptospiral infection. So suspected infection is any acute febrile illness with, as I said, three classical signs and three classical symptoms. We should actually suspect leptospirosis. And probable leptospirosis is any suspected case with positive presumptive laboratory diagnosis, and confirmed case of leptospirosis is any suspected case or probable case with confirmatory laboratory test. So what are the laboratory tests available? There's been a lot of different lab diagnosis techniques available described in literature, and in our clinical practice, we are not going to do any of these tests except, as I said, it is the microscopic agglutination test or ELISA testing or rapid immunochromatographic technique, the ICT rapid diagnostic testing. Other different ways of diagnosing are doing a culture during the initial leptospiremic or bacteremic phase, or doing or directly looking at the organism in a dark field microscopy, or doing some specific molecular testing in terms of PCR. So what are the samples actually tested for diagnosis of leptospirosis? You can test all the body fluids. Predominantly what we do is we'll check on blood and serum IgM levels, or IgM ELISA testing, or ICT testing, the chromatographic testing or rapid diagnostic testing. We can even check in the urine, or we can check in the CSF or any of the tissue fluids available for the diagnosis of leptospira. So the most commonly done tests are most commonly described testing are the microscopic agglutination testing, or the ELISA testing, or the ICT testing, the indirect immunochromatographic techniques. So what is this microscopic agglutination test? Is nothing but you are going to check for the antibodies by adding antigens into the serum. So in microscopic agglutination test, what we do is we'll take the serum and add on to the leptospiral antigens, and we'll see for the agglutination under microscope. So we'll see the dilution of the serum, and we'll label, or we will report the dilution of the serum where the 50% of agglutination occurs. So if you see on the right side of the slide, so this part actually shows the agglutination and this part shows non-agglutination of the spirochetes. So if 50% of the spirochetes or the antigens seems to be agglutinated, that will be the reported titer for microscopic agglutination test. Classically, as I said initially, even for this scrub typhus, we need to see for rise in titers, fourfold rise in titers for acute phase and convalescent phase to diagnose leptospira. So it is relatively cumbersome and your diagnosis is going to be delayed. So microscopic agglutination test is not done nowadays. So what we do most of the times is the indirect immunochromatographic testing, which is the rapid card testing which we do, or IgM ELISA. So in comparison with scrub typhus, ELISA, and ICT, these are also the rapid testing of ICT is more specific, but it is less sensitive. So if your rapid testing is negative, we should go for ELISA testing of IgM antibody to see for positivity of leptospiral IgM. And again, in comparison with scrub typhus, leptospira also, you may not find this antibody test positive in the earlier course of the disease, because the antibody response might take up to 10 days during acute symptomatic period. So the possibility of false negative test is high in the initial course of disease. So most of the times it becomes relatively mandatory to repeat the testing after 1 week if we suspect leptospirosis, if the suspicion of leptospirosis is significantly high. So one negative testing, especially with card testing or the ICT immunochromatographic testing, is not sufficient to rule out the leptospirosis. So this is the most common test we do even at our hospital. So what are the treatment options? Like any of the other multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, we should support the organs in terms of ventilation, renal replacement, and inotropic vasopressor support if needed. And the second, prevention of secondary bacterial infection and active treatment of secondary bacterial infection is the mandatory for treating any of the sickest ICU patients. The treatment options here also, again, doxycycline and azithromycin. As I said in previous discussion also, doxycycline will be, it is not the choice, especially during pregnancy and lactation, and especially in children. In those situations, azithromycin will be a choice. Apart from these things, because it is a spirochete, leptospira, the option of penicillins is there. So any of the penicillins, ceftriaxone, any of the penicillins like ampicillin or amoxicillin, or any of the cephalosporins, cefotaxime or ceftriaxone, can be used for specific diagnosis of leptospirosis, especially during pregnancy and in lactating mothers. As we discussed previously in one of our initial discussions, as a syndromic approach to tropical disease or acute febrile illness, doxycycline will be added to any of the acute febrile illness with encephalopathy or acute febrile illness with MOTS, because it is going to cover the most common other tropical diseases like both scrub typhus and leptospira. So doxycycline is a part of syndromic approach. But if you have specific diagnosis of leptospirosis, penicillins will be a good choice, and they'll be, I would say, relatively better choice compared to doxycycline for specific treatment of leptospirosis. And if patients are really sick with bad leptospiral infection with multi-organ dysfunction and acute kidney injury requiring renal replacement therapy, dose-modified IV crystalline will be a good choice, because this has almost a specific action on leptospira, and there's been no drug resistant to penicillin has been reported from India for IV crystalline penicillin. So as I said, usually leptospira will be treated as a part of syndromic approach. Again, there's a question about prophylaxis for tourism or tourists who are going to visit or places like endemic areas, or if you are in a post-flood, in a rescue camp into the areas of post-floods, is there any role for taking prophylaxis? Then I would say yes. Again, doxycycline will be the prophylaxis for all the people visiting to the endemic areas of leptospirosis, or if you are a part of a rescue team going to an area of floods, or you are in a part of that rescue camp, you should take doxycycline as a prophylaxis to prevent leptospirosis. And prevention in terms of environmental aspect, where you need to have better hygiene, and you need to prevent the indirect spread of disease through contaminated oil, contaminated water, and contaminated soil and food material. Is there any vaccine available for leptospirosis? Yes, there are vaccines available for leptospirosis, but the problem with vaccines for leptospirosis is, as I said in the initial discussion of leptospirosis, there's been 10 serovirus or 10 different types of leptospiral serovirus, which actually can cause a significant leptospiral infection. So, vaccine for one serovirus is not cross-protective, or cannot produce immunity for other serovirus. So, getting an vaccine or taking vaccine to prevent disease for all 10 serovirus will be a difficulty. So, that's why the vaccine for leptospirosis is not been very well promoted, or not been very well accepted. So there's been association of leptospirosis with India. So India is in India we have the WHO Collaborating Center for Leptospirosis. So we have a Regional Medical Research Center in Port Blair, which is in association. It works in association with WHO for research and vaccine production and treatment options for leptospirosis. So I'll stop here. I'll be available for any further discussion. Otherwise, I'll be available in all these three contacts. If there's any question or any query, you can reach me. Thank you. I'll wait for some time, and I'll look into the chat box, or if there are any specific questions.